The royal physician's scalpel trembled over the corpse, his hand shaking as the palace guards barred the door behind him. Outside, the queen, her face streaked with tears, sobbed that no one ever must see what lay between the king's legs. Inside, in the oppressive silence, the doctor lifted the sheet, gasped, and whispered the only word that truly made sense: monstrous. Can you imagine that scene? A secret so profound, so utterly horrifying that a queen would demand its eternal burial, even from the prying eyes of future anatomists. Keep listening, because by the end of this story, you won't just understand, you'll feel why Spain's crown tried so desperately to embalm a secret inside the man they famously called Ferdinand the Felon. This isn't just history, it's a chilling whisper from the past, and it's about to get very loud. Most textbooks, if they mention him at all, remember Ferdinand VII as the king who, rather unceremoniously, lost Spain's vast American empire. But tonight, we're not talking about dusty maps or dry treaties. Oh no, we're talking about the darkness, the rot that didn't just leak but gushed from his royal bedroom into every single corner of the nation. How did one man's deeply troubled body become a weapon so potent it terrorized women, grotesquely rewrote law, and nearly tore Spain apart at the seams? Seriously, grab a seat, maybe a stiff drink if you're feeling it, because this isn't just chronological, it's deeply psychological, and I promise you, it is anything but pretty. We're about to unpack a monarch whose personal depravity was so intertwined with his political tyranny, you'll wonder how Spain ever survived. Ferdinand's very first memories, we're told, weren't of gilded cradles or loving embraces, but of sheer, unadulterated terror. His father, Charles IV, was less a king and more a puppet, letting the sinister, smooth-talking minister Manuel Godoy run the entire court. Meanwhile, his mother, Maria Luisa, seemed to turn the palace corridors into whispering galleries of constant, scandalous affairs. It was a brutal education for a young prince. He learned early and painfully that love wasn't about affection. It was about leverage. And bodies? Well, bodies were just currency, to be traded, used, and discarded. But his torment wasn't just emotional or political. It was deeply, physically personal. Court doctors, in their hushed, confidential notes, recorded a marked tightness of the foreskin, a condition now known as phimosis that made the simple act of urination agonizingly painful. Surgery was considered, but ultimately deemed too risky for a prince, too fraught with potential complications. Translation? The boy grew up unable to perform even the most basic bodily functions without profound humiliation, a constant, searing reminder of his own perceived inadequacy. By 12, he was noticeably obese, a likely comfort against the emotional and physical pain. By 14, whispers suggested he was impotent, a devastating blow to a young man destined to produce heirs. And by 16, he was utterly convinced that every single laugh echoing down the long, cold palace hallways was aimed directly, cruelly at him. This simmering cauldron of shame, pain, and inadequacy began to forge a terrifying resolve within him. Power, he decided with a chilling certainty, would be his ultimate, brutal revenge. He'd make them all pay, every single one who had ever made him feel small or defective. When Napoleon's formidable armies marched toward Madrid in 1808, Ferdinand, far from being a loyal son or a patriotic prince, greeted the French agents with suspiciously open arms. He saw an opportunity, a twisted path to the throne he craved. He brazenly promised to hand over his own parents, Charles IV and Maria Luisa, if only Paris would guarantee him the crown. It was an act of familial treason so shocking, even the hardened French ambassador was taken aback. He wrote back to Paris with a clear note of warning. The prince is capable of anything. His smile freezes blood. Think about that for a moment. A man so cold, so calculating, that even Napoleon's envoy found him unnerving. Within weeks, Ferdinand's parents were indeed forced to abdicate. But the cunning Napoleon, ever the pragmatist, wasn't about to hand the keys to Spain to such an unstable, untrustworthy figure. Instead, he crowned his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte. Ferdinand found himself in a rather comfortable, albeit frustrating, house arrest. Yet even as he chafed in gilded cages, word of his betrayal spread like wildfire through occupied Spain. The story of the prince who had sold his family for a crown became a rallying cry, and the ignominious nickname El Rey Felon, the Felon King, was born. The humiliation, the public scorn festered within him, a deep festering wound that never truly healed. And it was there, in his enforced idleness, that the prince swore a terrible oath. When he finally returned to power, every liberal, every foreigner, every woman who had dared to laugh at him would pay dearly. He would exact a price for every perceived slight, every moment of weakness, every ounce of his shame. By 1816, the political tides had turned. Napoleon was defeated, and Ferdinand was finally truly king. Spain, weary from war and upheaval, desperately hoped that marriage might temper their notoriously volatile monarch. Perhaps a queen, a family, would soften his edges, bring some stability. He chose Maria Antonia of Naples, a 16-year-old girl who tragically spoke no Spanish and weighed less than half the king. She was, by all accounts, a child bride, thrust into a nightmare. What happened next isn't conjecture or rumor. It comes straight from the Queen's confessor, Father Hidalgo, whose incredibly damning diary was seized by French spies and, miraculously, still survives in Parisian archives today. His entries paint a horrifying picture. Her scream echoed through El Pardo. The king emerged bleeding from scratches, his nightshirt crimson. Can you imagine the terror? A young girl, alone, facing such a brutal ordeal. The queen cannot walk. Physicians speak of tearing. This isn't just pain, it's physical mutilation. The medical reports, often hidden or destroyed, hinted at unspeakable trauma. She miscarries every time he touches her. She now drinks laudanum by the bottle. The trauma was so profound, so constant, that her body simply couldn't sustain life. She turned to opiates, a desperate escape from her living hell. The chronic pain, the emotional distress, and the sheer physical brutality of her situation were unbearable. Within 18 months, Maria Antonia was dead, just 17 years old. The official cause, carefully crafted for public consumption, was melancholia, but the unofficial whisper, the horrifying truth that snaked through the court, was that Ferdinand's severe phimosis had made consummation not an act of union, but an act of butchery. The crown, in a desperate attempt to maintain appearances and silence the truth, paid nuns handsomely to mop blood from the royal sheets, literally scrubbing away the evidence of royal depravity. These nuns were then threatened with the full terrifying power of the Spanish Inquisition if they dared to speak a single word of what they had witnessed. The young queen's death was quickly dismissed, another inconvenient detail swept under the opulent carpets of the palace, but the stain of her suffering remained. Freed from the bother of a queen, and with his reign firmly established, Ferdinand wasted no time in reviving the dreaded Spanish Inquisition in 1814. But this wasn't the Inquisition of old, targeting Jews or Protestants for religious heresy. Oh no. Ferdinand repurposed this ancient instrument of terror, twisting it into something far more personal and perverse. Now its targets were often pretty girls who dared to say no, or whose families simply possessed something the king or his cronies desired. The process was chillingly simple, a horrifying blend of state power and personal lust. First, a family would be arrested, perhaps for owning a few banned books, or for some vaguely defined liberal sympathies. Then, the daughter, often young and vulnerable, would be offered a plea bargain. The terms: a solitary clandestine visit to the palace at dusk, notarized depositions, meticulously preserved in the Archivo General de Simancas, the Spanish National Archives, show a truly staggering pattern. 312 cases of alleged heresy or treason were mysteriously dropped the very next day after the accused women visited Ferdinand's chambers. Think about that. Hundreds of lives, families, reputations, all hanging on one terrifying night. One such girl, Carmen Ballesteros, bravely, perhaps foolishly, scribbled a defiant note on her release papers. It read, "He is built like a child, but bites like a wolf." A visceral, terrifying description of the man who held her fate in his hands. She was rearrested within a week, a stark warning of the king's vindictive nature. But her note, a tiny shard of truth in a sea of lies, survived only because a sympathetic, perhaps equally terrified, clerk hid it inside a reliquary, a sacred container for holy relics, effectively sanctifying her desperate plea. It stands as a chilling testament to the abuse of power and the courage of those who dared to whisper against it. Ministers at Ferdinand's court quickly learned a cardinal rule. Policy wasn't decided in council chambers or through reasoned debate. Oh no, policy was decided on pillows. Promotions, favors, even the king's ear went to whichever official arrived with the most beautiful niece, daughter, or ward to offer. It was a grotesque marketplace of flesh and power. Ladies-in-waiting, young women of noble birth, found themselves presented with an unspeakable choice. 2 hours in the king's infamous Little Temple, or immediate, humiliating exile to distant, desolate convents in North Africa. For many, especially those without family influence, the choice was no choice at all. And what was this Little Temple? It wasn't a place of worship despite its name. It was, in reality, a converted chapel, stripped of its religious sanctity and transformed into a chamber of pure, unadulterated perversion. Inside, Ferdinand had installed mirrors on every single wall, reflecting endlessly, creating a dizzying, disorienting space. Velvet cushions reeking of cloying violet oil were scattered everywhere. And then there were his treasures, a disturbing collection of wax figurines meticulously modeled on his own anatomy, only grotesquely exaggerated, grotesque caricatures of his own perceived flaws. Visitors, often terrified women, were forced to kneel before these obscene effigies while he, the king, would compare their living bodies to the cold, inanimate wax. The most obedient mistresses, those who played along with his degrading fantasies, received porcelain dolls as tokens, a twisted mockery of innocence. The others, they were quietly escorted out by masked priests. Yes, actual priests, complicit in this horror, and were never seen again, their fates swallowed by the silence of the palace. By 1820, the entire palace, once a symbol of Spanish grandeur, resembled, in the words of a shocked British diplomat, a Bourbon bordello staffed by terror. It was a court where piety was a mask, power was absolute, and perversion was the prevailing currency. Spain, ever hopeful, tried again. Isabella Braganza, a Portuguese princess, barely 19, became Ferdinand's wife number 2. The kingdom desperately needed an heir, a stable succession, but nature, it seemed, stubbornly refused to cooperate with Ferdinand's desires. Surgeons, discreetly, once again suggested a simple minor cut to relieve his persistent condition, the phimosis that had plagued him since childhood. But the king, consumed by paranoia and suspicion, vehemently banned the operation. He was convinced, with a terrifying certainty, that any blade near his manhood was part of a nefarious liberal conspiracy, an attempt to undermine his authority, his very essence. Instead of modern medicine, Ferdinand resorted to bizarre, almost pagan rituals. He forced Isabella to drink bull's blood, believing it would somehow imbue her with virility, and to bathe in mare's milk, convinced that its warmth would expand flesh, making her more fertile. When, predictably, pregnancy failed to materialize from these grotesque practices, his frustration curdled into public cruelty. He would parade his young life before shocked courtiers, tear her gown, and invite nobles to inspect her for hidden barrenness, a public humiliation designed to shift the blame from his own physical shortcomings onto her. She died just 9 months after the wedding, aged 20. Again, the official cause was melancholia. And again, whispers spoke of bruises, carefully hidden under wax-white makeup, a testament to the physical and psychological torment she endured. 2 queens buried, 2 young lives extinguished by his cruelty, and still no heir. At this point, the entire nation of Spain, weary and desperate, began to pray its king would simply stay single. The cost of his marriages was too high, paid in the lives of innocent women. Ferdinand's internal rage, fueled by his physical frustrations and deep-seated insecurities, increasingly turned outward, manifesting in public rituals of shame and degradation. On Good Friday in 1824, a day traditionally reserved for somber reflection, he staged what became known as the Procession of Virgins. It was an event of breathtaking cruelty. Every maiden in Madrid who wished to marry that year was ordered to march past the throne, a public spectacle designed to strip them of their dignity. Ferdinand himself sat, legs spread wide, his pants deliberately slashed, performing a grotesque parody of judgment. He held a velvet rod with which he would judge their purity. Those young women who flinched, who showed any sign of fear or discomfort, were immediately fined, their families publicly shamed. Those who, in a desperate attempt to appease him, managed a nervous smile, were escorted directly to palace chambers, their fate sealed by an enforced, terrifying compliance. And those who wept, whose terror was too profound to conceal, were whipped by priests. Yes, again, priests, for their impure thoughts. It was a horrifying inversion of religious tradition, a sacrilege committed in plain sight. A brave Madrid Gazette tried to print the story to expose this monstrous act. The editor was promptly castrated in the public square, a brutal public warning to anyone who dared to challenge the king's absolute power. People learned quickly, brutally, to clap as the virgins passed, to clap even louder as the girls screamed, desperately trying to save themselves from the king's wrath, or perhaps from becoming his next victim. The silence of the crowd was a complicity born of terror. By 1829, Ferdinand's health was in serious decline. Doctors, risking their necks, warned him that he wouldn't live to 40 unless the impasse down below was finally fixed. Spain's future, and his own, hung precariously in the balance. A new queen, Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, a woman of considerable strength and intelligence, managed to convince him to allow a minor surgery. She framed it carefully, not as a fix for his long-standing condition, but as a simple procedure to remove a wart. Perhaps the euphemism was enough to soothe his paranoid fears. Miraculously, the operation succeeded just enough. Within a year, Maria Cristina was pregnant. But Ferdinand, ever the paranoid monarch, couldn't simply accept this blessing. He convinced himself in a fit of delusion that the child was a liberal, sent by God specifically to punish him. His mind, twisted by years of shame and suspicion, concocted a chilling plan. He drew up a secret decree. If the baby was a girl, she would be switched with a boy, secretly smuggled in by nuns. A royal child, replaced by an unknown infant, all to satisfy the king's twisted fears and dynastic anxieties. Fate, however, intervened. Isabella II was born healthy, a girl, but the political climate, or perhaps Maria Cristina's firm hand, prevented the swap from ever happening. The decree, a terrifying testament to his paranoia, survived. Discovered decades later, it was irrefutable proof that the king feared his own blood, his own legacy, as much as he feared his most ardent political enemies. It showed how deeply his personal demons intertwined with the fate of his kingdom. In his final years, Ferdinand's eccentricities spiraled into full-blown paranoia and bizarre obsessions. He began collecting lambs, believing, with a childlike yet sinister logic, that their innocence might somehow rub off on him, purifying his own tainted soul. He insisted his servants dress these bewildered animals in delicate lace and carry them to chapel, a grotesque spectacle of forced piety. He couldn't bear to be watched, even in his sleep. His bedchamber became a sanctuary of silent witnesses. Countless porcelain dolls, their eyes painstakingly scratched out by the king himself, so they could not watch him dream, or perhaps witness his nightmares. Journals from 1832 paint a picture of a man utterly consumed by fear. He suspected poison in every cup, adultery in every corridor, convinced that his manhood, though barely functional and the source of so much personal agony, was the target of a vast European conspiracy. He believed foreign powers sought to undermine him through this most intimate vulnerability. When liberals dared to rise again in 1830, he crushed them with unimaginable brutality, butchering an estimated 40,000 people in Catalonia alone. He ordered corpses hung from balconies, a public display of terror, declaring that the very air tastes of my righteousness. His personal insecurities had metastasized into national terror, his private shame projected onto an entire populace. He was a king who ruled not with justice, but with the omnipresent threat of gruesome public death. On September 29, 1833, Ferdinand VII finally died. His body was bloated, his face pocked, a reflection of a life consumed by excess and internal decay. The royal coffin was escorted by generals who tellingly had learned to fear his silences more than his shouts, for in his quiet contemplation lay the seeds of his most brutal decrees. But the real drama, the final, horrifying act, unfolded behind closed doors. Physicians, tasked with preparing the royal body for embalming, made a gruesome discovery. Gangrene, a putrid black rot, was climbing rapidly up his groin. The preserving fluid, normally so effective, simply couldn't mask the stench of decay, the physical manifestation of his inner corruption. The Queen, Maria Cristina, faced with this unbearable truth, issued a shocking, unprecedented order. The king's corpse was to be split at the waist. The offending organ, the source of so much misery and scandal, was to be surgically removed and stored in a separate urn. Her grim decree had a clear, desperate purpose: to ensure that future anatomists, future historians, could never measure the physical reality of the king who had measured Spain by terror. No official portrait after his death ever dared to show anything below the chest again, a silent, lasting testament to the unspeakable secret they tried so hard to bury. Now, if this story, with its whispered secrets and shocking revelations, feels almost too grotesque to believe, remember this: the diaries, the decrees, the diplomatic dispatches, they're all real, all online, available for you to verify. History isn't always pretty, but it's always worth knowing. While you're listening to this story, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss next week's tale of the Queen who, with a flair for the dramatic and a desperate need for an army, sold her own crown jewels to buy a battalion. Trust me, it's another one for the books. Ferdinand, even in death, managed to leave Spain in a state of utter chaos. He left behind a 3-year-old heiress, Isabella II, whose claim to the throne was immediately disputed. He left a shattered economy, ravaged by years of war and his capricious, self-serving rule. And he left a brother, Don Carlos, who, clinging to archaic Salic law, claimed the throne was his by God and nature, not by Ferdinand's late-in-life decree. The result? The devastating Carlist Wars erupted, a series of brutal civil conflicts that would kill another 200,000 Spaniards. Historians often try to simplify these wars, blaming them on abstract concepts like religion or regionalism. But if you trace the root, if you dig deep enough, you find the inescapable truth. It all stemmed from one man's stubborn, paranoid refusal to fix a simple yet profoundly impactful medical flaw. His personal pathology became the nation's political catastrophe. Generals marched under banners of chastity and tradition, yet many carried lockets containing miniature anatomical wax figures, copies of Ferdinand's own grotesque collection, as macabre talismans. It was chilling proof that his perversion hadn't just seeped into the court. It had become intertwined with the very fabric of politics, a symbol of loyalty, however twisted. Spain's constitution, a document meant to bring stability, was rewritten an astonishing 9 times in 40 years. Each draft a desperate attempt to find equilibrium, and in every single draft, in every public utterance, there were careful, often verbose mentions of family values and sacred traditions, precisely because no one dared to speak the king's name in connection with the true, horrifying cause of their nation's suffering. His unspoken shame became a national trauma. Walk through modern Madrid today, and you'll notice something striking. You won't find a single statue of Ferdinand VII proudly displayed in the city center. His presence, or rather his deliberate absence, speaks volumes. Travel to the royal pantheon at the Escorial, and you'll see his urn placed conspicuously apart from the other kings, almost as if the shame still drips, contaminating the very air around his remains. Yet despite this historical erasure, his methods echo, subtly and terrifyingly, through time. His playbook is disturbingly familiar. Use fear to silence dissent. Use women as currency for power. Use religion as a convenient, hypocritical cover for personal depravity. When contemporary strongmen in any corner of the world flirt with absolutism, they rarely resurrect the image of Napoleon, the grand conqueror, number. They often, perhaps unknowingly, resurrect the ghost of Ferdinand, the monarch who proved with chilling effectiveness that you can govern an empire. You can control a nation if you terrorize half its population, one bedroom, one terrified individual at a time. His reign is a stark, uncomfortable reminder that the most intimate forms of control can be the most devastatingly effective. History textbooks, bless their sanitized hearts, often skipped these pages, preferring to focus on grand battles and sweeping political movements. But we didn't. We believe that the full, unvarnished truth, even the uncomfortable parts, deserves to be told. If you want more forgotten scandals, more hidden histories, delivered with receipts and unflinching honesty, then tap that like button. Seriously, every single click tells the algorithm that truth, however dark, deserves views, deserves to be heard. And hey, drop a comment below. Was Ferdinand the sickest sovereign ever to grace a throne, or can you name someone worse? I promise you, I read every single reply. Let's keep this conversation going. So, the true mystery of Ferdinand VII isn't really about a deformed body, is it? It's far more profound than that. It's about what happens, what truly happens when absolute power collides head-on with absolute shame. One man's private agony, his deep-seated insecurities and physical torment, warped an entire nation's destiny, twisting its path for generations. Spain needed 3 brutal civil wars, countless lives lost, just to exhale, just to begin to purge the poison he left behind. Remember his story, his horrifying legacy, the next time you hear someone say that cruelty belongs only on battlefields, or that tyranny is only a public affair. Because sometimes the most lethal, most insidious weapon a king can wield is the terror he hides, not in his arsenal, but beneath his very own sheets.